Well,
So.
we're on Linebrook Road,
Okay.
which was once called Boxford Road because it's, you know, a road that goes to Boxford. The people who lived out here in this neighborhood, out past Pinefield, out where we're standing, and on out Linebrook Road, formed their own parish, which means they could have their own church. And as you may know,
1647.
it was 1740 when they did that. 1740 is when they finally got their own parish.
Okay.
And the people in Essex and the people in Hamilton had already done it. They were still part of Ipswich. Essex was called Tobacco. Hamilton was called the Hamlet. And these were places that were so remote. To get on your horse and go to church on Sunday morning was an all-day thing. They wanted their own church.
Okay.
So they did. So the reason we're standing right here is this is kind of where it started. It was actually defined, Linebrook Parish was defined by 5 brooks, one of them being Bull Brook,
Okay.
Egypt River, Batchelder Brook, Gravelly Brook, and a line that connected those from Hood Pond. And so they called it, with great imagination, Linebrook.
Okay.
So what we're at right here is about where it starts realistically, the houses. And this is the Joseph Conan house. It's a first period house, one of our about 50 first period houses in Ipswich. And from here on out till we get to Route 1, we'll pass several houses that belong to the Conant family and the Foster family. And we'll chat about them as we go.
All right. Do it.
Not her driveway. The next one on the left, you can't quite see it, but it's right there.
All right, we're at the intersection of Linebrook and Route 1.
This is called the Corporal John Foster House, and it's in really bad repair, but it has a story. There was a Reverend Bentley from Salem who decided to, in about the year 1800, to take a ride out here and see about this place, which at that time it wasn't called Linebrook as much as it was called Firetown or Ipswich Farms. Those were kind of derogatory names, but especially the Firetown. He went to Topsfield first, and he said he never in his life had he ever met people who gave him so many different directions that none of which would get him to the right place. But he finally found the Linebrook Church, which we're going to see soon.
Okay.
And then it took him so long that, being 4 or 5 miles to get into town, he stayed here at Corporal John Foster's Inn.
It was a little bit better shaped.
Well, it was a little better.
Yeah, okay.
Corporal Foster had a sign out in front, which has been hanging in the Ipswich Museum's carriage house now for over 100 years. He said, I shoe the horse, I shoe the ox, I make the box, I make the nails, and I entertain some strangers too. Obviously, he shoed horses,
Yeah.
and he ran a little tavern here on the corner. And by then, the Newbury Turnpike was brand new. The road, which missed every town and went over every hill, was right here. And they built it so straight that it went over every hill, and it took quite a number of years before they could actually get stagecoaches and cars that were strong enough to get over the hills, as we all know from Topsfield. So he stayed here overnight, and Corporal Foster was such an eccentric that he would not answer your questions unless you called him Corporal. But unfortunately, it looks like the house has seen its history too. It has a 1-year demolition delay on it right now, and then after that, unless somebody wants to take what's left of this house.
Who's going to take it down?
The
town?
Well, the owner needs to do something with it. It's difficult to
So it's not abandoned in that. Somebody owns it.
He owns it, and he's looked for someone to move the house for about 4 years now. But people who look at it become very discouraged. What I want to do now is head on out on the other side of Route 1, which is where I feel like Linebrook Parish really exists, the core of Linebrook Parish. And we're going to go over to Leslie Road and go out and see the first Linebrook Church was.
Okay.
I guess it's not. Maybe we'll see it later. Let's stop here for a second because there was a schoolhouse. One of our old schoolhouses was right here. Right in this little spot. See if we can see the foundation. So we're at intersection of Leslie Road, which was named after the first minister of Linebrook Parish, Reverend Leslie, and Linebrook Road. The church, the Linebrook Church now is down a little further down Linebrook Road. Right here was a schoolhouse. It was a one-room schoolhouse in the 1800s. It was, I believe, it was moved into Ipswich and is a garage now. But there was a one-room schoolhouse, and this is the foundation of that old schoolhouse.
Oh wow!
They had a tavern. Of course, we just visited one, but there was another tavern right over here, kind of across the road, and they had their own militia. So so yes,
All
indeed.
4 of them? What?
They had their own militia in Linebrook. It was usually around 20, 30, young men who lived
Yeah.
out here because it wasn't a real big community. They fought in their own group in the Revolutionary War. Went to went to
wow.
Charlestown, and then they fought as a Linebrook militia in the Civil War. So this little community out here had quite its own identity, and they were somewhat eccentric. It started out here.
I mean, did they break with the boys in town?
Every time they did that, the boys in town at the main church really hated it when parishes would break away because it was about money.
Sure.
You paid your money to the church, and so what happened is in 1740 or so, people out here said, we got a lot of people out here. We want our own church, and the state of Massachusetts, the state legislature, passed a bill creating Linebrook Parish and defined it by those 5 brooks in the line, and we're sort of in the heart of it. So they parts of Boxford and parts of Thompsonville are actually included, but eventually it came down to basically the houses right along this road and out this way. As a matter of fact, the first church was right down here. The church is gone. There's a cemetery with no markers, but there's also the place where Reverend George Whitefield preached to thousands out here in Linebrook Parish. Let's go take a look at that.
All right.
We're on Leslie Road, just over the town line in Raleigh, because when they laid out Linebrook Parish, they made it big enough to include disgruntled people over in the 133 neighborhood who didn't want to go all the way to Raleigh on their horses. Right. So that neighborhood was called Rudy Plain. Rudy Plain, and there's still a little store down at the intersection down there. But the church was back in there, and even the foundation is very hard to find. And in here was the first cemetery. There are graves in there. We have a list of the people who are buried there, but we don't know exactly where those graves were. This is where the church was. Now, what they did, they built the church about 1746, 49, somewhere in there, and then they moved it up to where the present Linebrook Church is, which we're going to see. Okay. And then that one is actually the next building that they built. Right. But the Reverend George Whitefield, it's like the Billy Graham of the day. Okay. You've probably heard the story of the Devil's Footprint at First Church in Ipswich. Yeah. And when he came to Ipswich, because he came to America, loved America, he actually settled there.
Rebecca Pugh and I did a piece on that, and she says, stick your foot down there, and it was perfect. And she says, if the shoe fits, so.
Yeah. She was I'm a little guy, but my feet are too big, so I'm off the hook on that. Well, he had to stand on the rocks there at the First Church in Ipswich, because anytime anything was going on, it didn't matter if it was a hanging or a minister or a political convention or whatever, everybody came, because let's face it, there was no YouTube, there was nothing else to do. So everybody would come. This guy had a commanding voice, and he spoke to thousands there in the church, and which scared the devil out of town. Well, then I'm not sure which exactly, if it was the same year, but he came out, to be fair to these people out here at Linebrook Parish, and he came to preach their church. Well, the same thing happened. Now, it was only maybe, just a handful of families, but there again, 1,000, 2,000 people showed up. The guy had this commanding voice, so he found a ledge up here, which is called Pulpit Rock, and that's where he preached. So why don't we take a short hike up here, see if we can find Pulpit Rock.
He's the man who drove the devil out.
That's right. So take yourself back to early 1740s. Reverend George Whitefield from England is here. He's the biggest thing. It was the beginning of the Great Awakening. Because, let's face it, the Puritans had really blown it. They had done the whole witchcraft thing, which we're going to talk about. When he came along, he revived the congregational movement. So this is where he stood up here on this rock up here. And they said it was over 1,000 people, so you can imagine 1,000 people. It was, Woodstock on Linebrook Parish.
Wow.
It's a nice little place. It's like a little park.
A little glen.
Yeah, it's amazing. one of the biggest farms, totally Pearlie farm. And he built the barns, the original. Built this wonderful Victorian house.
Oh, that's beautiful.
He had 1,000 acres.
Oh, wow.
Big cattle farm. He was the biggest cattle farmer in Essex County at one time.
From Pulpit Rock to the Linebrook Church.
The present Linebrook Church. Maybe right around 1800 or a little before, they moved the church over here, probably indicating that this is where all the people were.
And what was the population?
Well, the population out here was, I suspect, in the parish, probably was maybe a couple hundred people or something like that. There was only a few families. Households, there was probably like maybe 30 households that could say they were in Linebrook Parish. Okay. 20 years after they moved the church over on Leslie Road and rebuilt it here, they were going through one of their growth spurts at the church. And they had 2 cemeteries, 3 if you include the original one out on Leslie Road that has no stones. There's a new Linebrook Cemetery is up on the right, and that is a lot of graves there date to the 1900s. And then we're going to go down to the intersection, the triangular intersection there where the old Linebrook Cemetery is. Why that's so far away from the church, I don't know, but it does date back to even before the church was founded. So that'll be our next stop.
All right.
Well, now we're at the old Linebrook cemeteries. It dates back to before the establishment of the church at that location.
Okay.
So there are graves here that go back to the 1700s. Maybe less than a dozen, maybe 10 families. The Conants and the Fosters and the Pearlies and the Howes. And they ended up all marrying each other. So if you look at any of these family names, you're going to get that. So the history is this. By about 1750 or so, Ipswich was settled in 1734. 1733 became Ipswich in 1734. People started coming out here to live. Now it's too far away, but they formed kind of their own community. And originally, there were farms, and it was called Ipswich Farms. There was huge farms. One of the first industries was actually clearing the trees, and massive amounts of oak and other trees were shipped into town to the wharf, and they were good quality straight trees, old growth trees that were used for ships.
I was going to ask you, was that some of the lumber that was in the shipyards that were built?
That's right. It was a shipyard building. The sea captains would come down here to Linebrook to pick out the tree they wanted, and they were taken on these roads. You can imagine that the roads weren't nearly as nicely paved back in those days. This is an old road that the Indians used. This is one of the oldest ways.
Wow.
An Indian path that became the road. Easily became a road out to Linebrook, and it goes on over to the lakes over in Andover, North Andover. So they began farming this land they cleared, and 2 of the earliest families were the Howes and the Pearlies. The Howes didn't do so well. The Pearlies did great. The Pearlies established a house right over here, and another one over here, and next generation farmhouse, 1700. Huge houses. Pearlie houses out here are large. On the other hand, James Howe and his wife Elizabeth arrived, and they had a farm right over here.
Okay.
And they were modest means. The Howe family also grew as well, but never did as well as the Pearlies, and the Pearlies were kind of buying up the land. So this leads me into the Salem witchcraft. Rebecca Nurse was the first accused by these deranged girls actually in Danvers, which was Salem Village. The Putnams, who had problems with Rebecca Nurse's family, also had issues with people out here in Topsville because the Putnams were kind of greedy land grabbers. They were making claims on some of the lands out here in Topsville, and the Howes were related. So they made they picked up an old claim about Elizabeth Howe that she was a witch. The Pearlies, they're an admirable family, but there was a Pearlie family out here that was always accusing Elizabeth Howe of bewitching their cows, bewitching their daughter, making their daughter sick. So 1692, the bewitched girls point out Elizabeth Howe living out here, and one of the Pearlie families who had issues with her provided ample evidence that they had seen her walking on the water and bewitching their daughter. That he had killed the livestock. That things always went bad after they passed the Pearlie passed out. She was taken. She and Rebecca Nurse were among the first 4 women who hung in 1692 in Salem. And the woman.
So they took her from here, and she was hung with the.
That's right.
In Salem.
She was hung in Salem after just a few months.
Wow.
Now while we're talking about the preachers, the ministers in Ipswich were all opposed to this, as were many of the people in the community. The community was divided because it depended on who your loyalty was. Were you closer relatives to the Pearlies, closer to the house?
Wow.
And so the neighborhood, the people in the neighborhood, actually were divided in testimony. Someone gave me testimony she was a wonderful person. But the Pearlies for years had prevented her from becoming a member of the church in Ipswich because of their issues with her. They also wanted the land. Yeah. I don't think they ever got it. So you see here a very large Howe tombstone and other families that are here as well. Martin Van Buren Pearlie became some of the best historians of our area, especially writing about Linebrook. But MVB Pearlie wrote histories of many of the towns in Essex County. And Sidney Pearlie also published a number of documents about Linebrook, the Howes, the Elizabeth Howe. A lot of our history, a lot of my history that I put on the site. I don't make any of it up. I have to go find it. And this guy, along with Thomas Franklin Waters,
good reference,
where I get a lot of my history. And there's this grave right there.
Where were the witches buried?
Gallows Hill, and only in the last few years do they think that they've been able to confirm the exact location.
It's in Salem.
It's in Salem, I think, and remember when we were back at Pulpit Rock with a large rock? It's a formation there with a lot of granite. I don't know if it's old or if it's glacial granite, but I believe last I read is that their bodies were probably thrown down in a crevice in the rocks, and that's why there's no real grave. So she wasn't buried here.
Okay.
But her children survived, her husband survived, and the Howe family continued to grow. And the interesting thing is, the Howes and the Pearlies intermarried. Maybe we'll stop by the site where her house was.
Yeah.
And right in front of that is a beautiful home built by Eliza Howe Pearlie, considered one of the finest Greek Revival cottages. And then she divorced Mr. Pearlie and ran that farm by herself. Eliza
That was
Howe.
unheard of back then, wasn't it?
Well, 1800s. So there were some strong women in all centuries.
Okay.
Alan Pearlie, in the middle of the winter, dragged a little 1-over-1 room house across a frozen marsh, supposedly, according to records. It was located almost where we were at the pulpit. Dragged that by oxen, right over around the corner. He built an addition on one side. His son then added an addition on the other side, and now it's a gorgeous 1800s house with, in the core of it, a house that is probably dates to the 1700s. In Ipswich, you can walk in the houses, you can read their stories written by Martin Van Buren, and then you can visit their graves right here at the old Linebrook Cemetery. How cool is that? So I was just talking about the Alan Pearlie house, and this is the house he built out here a little further out on Linebrook Road. According to what was written by Martin Van Buren Pearlie, the historian, the core of the house was moved from Leslie Road, then he added on here and added on here. So the Pearlie family became pretty big landowners at this end of Linebrook and also at the other end of Linebrook out closer to Route 1. And I was very fortunate to get to do some carpentry work on this house this winter. The floors are old, they curve, they sag, they go every which way, and you know you're in an old house when you're in this house. It was a wonderful experience to get to work there. So the barn that we're looking at is called the Abraham Howe Barn. Records indicate that it was built around 1700 or early 1700s. So it is actually, parts of it are a first period barn.
It's inhabited now, right?
It was, I think it was around 1940s that it was converted into a house.
Okay.
the features that tell us that it has some first period characteristics is when you go in the attic. I always like to look at the bones of a house, the master rafters, the purlins, the vertical sheathing, where the chimneys were. If you go in the basement, you see, you know, the massive stone base where these chimneys were. And so somewhere around 1740s, probably was a pretty big job, but they put the house on a foundation and the barn turned it into a house. The yellow house that we see here is a modern house. But when they were digging the foundation for that house, on the right-hand side, Tammy, one of the owners, saw that they were digging into a foundation of an old house. And she began collecting artifacts out of it, and soon realized they knew this was the approximate location of Elizabeth's house, Homestead, but she realized they were digging up the foundation, digging into the foundation, so they maintained it, and she was able to recover dozens of artifacts from that era. So she also had this sign created, Elizabeth Howe Homestead, 1658. Wow. Now, this house here, if you look at the way this house was built, you're going to see at least half a dozen houses that look very similar. It was a popular Greek revival form of architecture.
Particularly the doorway?
That's right.
Okay.
So there was an architect who became very famous named Asher Benjamin. He wrote a book of design, and one of the features was that kind of doorway. When you see that doorway with those pediments over it and the side lights, you have an Asher Benjamin doorway. This was said to be one of the finest finished homes. It was built by a woman named Eliza Pearlie Howe. I believe that she was the Pearlie and she married a Howe. Okay. Interestingly enough, they didn't get along. And they got divorced, and she ran the farm out here until, I think, into her 80s or 90s. And
wow!
It was very well known. It's, you know, everything about it's been wonderfully restored, and had received the Mary Conley Award for historic preservation a number of years ago.
The windows on the upper level are a little odd, but
well, that's the distinguishing characteristic of that particular house. Out in this area, some of them don't have the windows.
Rather than having a gable or something there.
Right, and some of them it's story and a third is what I've heard it called. Okay. But I think they're very attractive, very practical.
Oh yeah, no, it is.
Very nice houses.
All right, we're decompressing now because it's 98 or 99 degrees outside, so we're
at a minimum.
We're going to thank Gordon for this piece while we're riding in the air-conditioned comfort.
I always like to go out this neighborhood, Linebrook, and there's something just kind of odd and special about it.
Well, then it ends at Hood's Pond, which is kind of like a